Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Model Building Tips. In this episode, I'm going to fix the wheel gauge and install a working front coupler on my Bachmann N scale 280. This N-scale Bachmann 280 consolidation locomotive is one that I've painted and detailed for my fictitious North Coast Railroad. This model already has LokSound DCC and sound installed, a LokSound Power Pack capacitor, and I've also reworked the front headlight and added a functional rear headlight. I scratch-built the oil bunker for the tender. It's a freelance design that's meant to be reminiscent of some Santa Fe tenders. This is a nice-looking and smooth-running locomotive, but there are a couple things about it I'm not happy with. The first and biggest problem is that the drive wheels are slightly narrow in gauge. This doesn't cause problems on some track like Cotto Unitrack. My N-scale Siren Creek layout, however, has hand-laid Code 40 rails on PC board ties, and everything is done to strict NMRA standards. This track isn't forgiving of out-of-gauge wheel sets. The second problem is a lack of a working front coupler. I'm hoping to use this model as the main standard gauge steam engine on the Siren Creek layout, and to make it useful for switching, I really need to be able to couple on both ends. I'm going to tackle the wheel gauge problem first. If you're not familiar, the flanges on each pair of wheels should fit easily into the slots in the NMRA standards gauge. This one is narrow, so the second wheel is out of position and can't go into the slot. I'll need to remove the drivers to fix this. To do that, I'll start by removing the bottom cover plate. I'll also need to disconnect the drawbar that holds the engine and tender together. This is tricky on my engine because I did a custom DCC install and there are wires running between the two. There's a third screw in the back under the cab. I also need to make sure that the vertical grab irons at the back of the cab are disconnected on one end. With the cover plate loose, I can remove the pilot truck. Then I can work the cover plate free. I'll have to be careful not to lift all the drive wheels out. The brake detail attached to the cover plate tends to want to grab the wheels. It's best to keep the engine upside down at this point, otherwise all the wheels will fall out and they can be tricky to get back in. In order to work on one wheel set at a time, I'll use a small flat-bladed screwdriver to gently pry the pins holding the side rods to the rearmost driver set. When the pin is part way out, I can grab it with some small pliers. I'd recommend putting all the parts in a container of some kind. They're tiny and easily lost. Now I can pull the driver set. Before I do anything else, I'm going to use a Sharpie to mark the left side wheel bearing. That will help make sure I can put the driver set back in the proper orientation later. This puller is from Great Plains. I think it's intended for the RC hobby, but it has a small enough point to make it useful for N-scale trains. Always use a puller when regauging steam locomotive drivers. Never twist them. It will likely mess up the quartering and the steam locomotive will run badly if it runs at all. If you're not familiar with the term, quartering refers to the fact that on most steam locomotives, the crank pins are set 90 degrees apart. It's critical that all the driver sets are at the same angle or the side rods will bind. Using a puller ensures that the wheel will move along the axle but won't twist. I've put the driver into the puller and tightened it until the thin rod is dead center on the driver axle. Now I can slowly turn the tool to adjust the wheel gauge. It's important to go very slowly. You don't want to push the axle all the way through the wheel, as that would also mean that the driver set would need to be re-quartered. And when I say go slow, I mean very slight micro turns. When turning the crank, it doesn't feel like anything is happening, but the wheel is moving along the axle. I moved the crank just a little, checked the gauge, and then did it again until the wheels were spaced properly. Now I can put that wheel set back in the locomotive. The square bearings fit into slots in the frame. I find it's usually best to get one side started, then move to the other side and use a small screwdriver to rotate it until it drops in. On this engine, the middle two driver sets are geared. The front and rear driver sets are driven by the side rods. That means that there are no crank pins to worry about on the second axle and it comes right out. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a wrinkle. Because of the gear, this driver set won't fit into the puller. I also have an NWSL puller. The rod on the end of this one is a little bigger than on the Great Plains tool, but it's just small enough that I think it'll work. I had to use the optional plate to make the opening small enough to hold the N-scale driver set. It took maybe a quarter of a turn to get the axle to move, and that was enough to correct this wheel set. I can't stress enough how important it is to go slowly and check the gauge frequently. The procedure to re-gauge the front driver set is exactly the same as for the rear driver set, though it's a little more difficult because it's not as accessible. Getting the crank pins back in the first and last drivers is a little tricky. You can do it with your fingers, but be careful not to put pressure on both sides of the axle or the wheel set may slip out of gauge again. The main driver is probably the hardest. This looks like it has a screw holding it, but don't be fooled. It's another pin. The screw is for adjusting the eccentric crank angle. Before removing the pins, I'm going to take a photo of the crank orientation on both sides with my phone. That will help me to get it back in the same position later. Pulling the pins on each side is actually pretty easy. Since this one also has an axle gear, once it was out I used the NWSL puller just like I did for the second driver. Now all the drive wheels are in gauge. I've put the bottom cover back on but left off the front screw since the pilot truck is still detached. For now the engine is an 080, but it should still run. So now for the moment of truth. Let's see how well it runs. The engine is still smooth and there's no binding, so I didn't mess up the quartering when I re-gauged the wheels. Since the pilot truck is still off the engine, now is a good time to see what we can do about the dummy coupler in front. The shelf on the back of the microtrain's coupler height gauge shows where the coupler mount should be in order for the coupler height to come out with a conventional coupler. Unfortunately, on this engine the mount is more or less even with the top of the pilot deck. The dummy coupler will pull out, so let's go ahead and remove it. The hole in the pilot is too small for a working coupler, so whatever solution I come up with is going to involve making modifications to the pilot. I've put the pilot truck back in temporarily. As you can see, there's also not a lot of front-to-back clearance to mount a coupler on this engine. This is a Microtrain's 2004 underset shank coupler. Normally I'm not a fan of offset shank couplers, but in this situation I don't see a good alternative that doesn't involve completely rebuilding the entire pilot. Looking again at the pilot, I think I can remove the original draft gearbox and make an opening that should be about the same size as the Microtrain's draft gearbox. To make it easier to work on, I'm going to remove the screw that holds the pilot. Then I'll hold the cylinders while working the pilot loose so I don't mess up the side rods. Now that it's out, you can see that the pilot has pins that fit holes in the bottom of the smoke box. It was a little hard to show while I was doing it, but these have to be dislodged when removing the pilot. I'll use a small flat-bladed screwdriver to pop off the air hose detail. To make more room, my plan is to remove the underside of the draft gearbox detail. My sprue cutters are a little big to really get in there. I cut some, but they don't penetrate far enough. I'll finish the cutting with a hobby knife. Now that I have a big enough opening, I can enlarge it more with a square needle file. After some careful filing and trimming, the opening is now considerably larger. The Microtrain's draft gearbox will now fit through the opening. To get the coupler height to come out right, I had to glue a small piece of 10,000 styrene under the pilot as a shim. I drilled a small hole and used a cut-down Microtrain's 0090 screw to mount the coupler. The height is pretty close to correct. So far so good, but let's see how the engine performs on the Siren Creek layout. It's doing much better. It's still bouncing a little on a couple of the turnouts, but not all of them. Since the engine wheels are now engaged, I suspect that the track still needs a little tweaking. The pilot truck was hitting the coupler on the tighter curves, so I filed it and trimmed the back of the draft gearbox for a little clearance. With a working coupler on the front, the engine is now more than capable of switching cars. With the correct wheel gauge and a working front coupler, this cool little engine is even better and more useful. If you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.